I never thought that my wife will fuck everyone she lost in bow. Hey everyone, I never thought I'd be here, pouring my guts out to strangers on the internet, but life's thrown me a curveball, and I'm hoping writing this might help me process it all. My name's Mike, I'm 36, and I've been married to my wife, Jessica, for 6 years. At least I thought I was happily married, until a year ago. Jessica is, or was, a competitive bowler. It wasn't exactly a glamorous hobby, but she loved it, and I supported her every step of the way. She joined a local league shortly after we got married, and while I never quite understood the appeal of spending every Thursday night in a dimly lit bowling alley, it made her happy. I was just the proud husband, cheering her on from the sidelines. At first, everything seemed fine. Jessica wasn't great at bowling. Actually, she was kind of terrible, but she loved the social aspect. She'd come home beaming, talking about how her team had done, even if she hadn't scored much herself. I admired her spirit. She wasn't the type to give up, even if she was perpetually at the bottom of the scoreboard. Then about a year ago, things started to change. Jessica got competitive, really competitive. She'd come home after matches in a terrible mood if she lost, ranting about how unfair it was that the other players were showing off their skills. She started practicing more, spending entire weekends at the bowling alley. At first, I thought it was great that she was so passionate about something. But then I noticed other changes, subtle ones at first. Her phone was suddenly always face down on the table. She'd giggle at random texts and say they were from her teammates. Her usual open demeanor turned cagey, defensive. The Real kicker came about 6 months ago. Jessica came home late from a match, reeking of cheap beer and wearing a grin that didn't quite match her story. She claimed she'd gone out for a team celebration after losing to some guy named Brian, a name she casually mentioned way too often. My gut told me something wasn't right, but I didn't push. I wanted to trust her. It wasn't until 2 weeks ago that everything came crashing down. Jessica had been losing a lot lately. Her opponents were always these hotshot bowlers, guys who strutted around the lanes like they owned the place. She'd come home angrier each time, snapping at me over the smallest things. One night, after another practice session, I decided to surprise her with dinner. I knew she'd been stressed, and I figured a nice meal might smooth things over. I drove to the alley where she said she'd be practicing. Her car was in the lot, but when I walked inside, the lanes were quiet. No Jessica, no league players, just the hum of the ball return machines and a lone guy mopping the floor. I asked him if he'd seen her. He just shrugged and said, "Yeah, she left with some guy an hour ago." My heart sank. I drove home, hoping she'd be there, but the house was dark. Jessica didn't come home until after midnight, mumbling something about extra practice. That was when I noticed the faint outline of a red mark on her neck, a mark she hadn't had when she left that afternoon. That night, I couldn't sleep. My brain wouldn't stop spinning. Every odd behavior, every late night, every offhand mention of an opponent, it all started to click. The truth was staring me in the face, but I didn't want to believe it. Jessica wasn't just losing matches. She was making up for them, with the guys who beat her, and I was done being blind to it. What I didn't know then was just how deep this rabbit hole went. The morning after Jessica's late-night practice, I decided to follow my gut. Something was off, more than just the late nights and defensive attitude. I wasn't proud of it, but I needed answers. That afternoon, while she was in the shower, I grabbed her phone. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through her messages. Most of the chats were innocent enough. Stuff with her sister, some group chats about bowling league schedules. Then I saw a conversation with Brian B. That name, the guy she kept losing to. The messages weren't overtly incriminating at first. Casual talk about matches, equipment, upcoming league events. But the further I scrolled, the less innocent they became. Brian B., you looked amazing last night. That dress was killer. Jessica, you weren't so bad yourself, champ. Brian B., next time, we skip the beer and head straight to my place. Jessica, behave, LOL. The blood drained from my face. I wanted to believe it was just flirting, something harmless, but my gut knew better. The final nail in the coffin was a photo he'd sent of himself, shirtless, flexing in what looked like his bedroom mirror. Her response? A single emoji. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I couldn't confront her yet. Not until I was sure. I needed more proof. The next few days were agonizing. Every time Jessica kissed me goodbye or gave me a casual love you before leaving for practice, I felt sick. But I had a plan. Thursday night, her league's match was scheduled against Brian's team. She told me she was heading straight to practice and wouldn't be home until late. I nodded, smiled, and told her to have fun. As soon as she pulled out of the driveway, I grabbed my keys and followed her. I parked a block away from the bowling alley, slouching low in my seat like some low-budget private investigator. Jessica's car was already there. From the shadows, I watched her get out, dressed in jeans and a fitted top she didn't usually wear to matches. She walked inside, her posture nervous, like she was scanning the lot for anyone watching. I waited a few minutes before heading in myself, trying to act casual. The place was buzzing with activity. Teams warming up, people ordering beer and nachos, the sound of balls thundering down the lanes. I spotted Jessica immediately, standing at a far lane with Brian. She wasn't bowling. She wasn't even holding a ball. They were talking, standing way too close. He leaned in, whispering something in her ear that made her laugh and slap his arm playfully. It was like watching someone I didn't even recognize, a version of Jessica I'd never seen before. My hands clenched into fists. I wanted to march over there and confront them both, but I wasn't ready. Not yet. I slipped out unnoticed, waiting in the parking lot. My heart raced as I imagined how this would go down. Would she go straight home after the match? Would Brian leave alone? I sat there for over 2 hours, watching people trickle out one by one. Then I saw them. Jessica and Brian walked out together, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. Instead of heading to their cars, they turned toward his, a beat-up old truck parked near the back. He opened the passenger door for her, and she climbed in without hesitation. I felt like my heart was being shredded in real time. They drove off, and I followed, staying far enough back to avoid suspicion. After about 10 minutes, they pulled into the lot of a cheap motel. My stomach churned. I parked on the street, watching as they went inside, disappearing into one of the rooms. That was it. There was no denying it now. I sat there for what felt like hours, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I wanted to storm into that motel, kick down the door, and let them know exactly what I thought of them. But something held me back. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was shock, or maybe I just wanted to figure out my next move without completely losing it. When Jessica finally came home that night, smelling like cheap motel soap, she kissed me on the cheek and said she'd had a long night. I looked her straight in the eye and smiled. "I bet you did," I said. She froze for half a second, just a flicker of panic, but then shrugged it off and went to bed. That night I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront her yet. Not until I had everything lined up. I'd been a supportive, trusting husband for 6 years, and she'd turned me into a fool. Now it was my turn to play the game and make sure I won. The morning after Jessica's late-night motel escapade, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, my mind spinning. I'd never felt so calm and so furious at the same time. Jessica walked in, groggy and disheveled, giving me a half-hearted smile as she poured herself a cup. "Late night?" I asked casually, not even looking up from my phone. "Yeah," she replied, yawning. "Practice ran long, and I grabbed a drink with the team after." There it was again, another lie, so smooth it would have fooled me 6 months ago. I felt my jaw clench, but forced myself to stay composed. I decided that morning it was time to start covering my bases, if this was going to get messy. And let's be honest, it already was. I needed to make sure I came out of it intact. Step 1. Disentangle my life from Jessica's as much as possible. While she was off at work, I started making quiet moves. I opened a separate bank account, transferred over enough money to cover my expenses, and spoke to my buddy, Eric, who worked in IT. He helped me set up a backup of all her phone data, texts, call logs, even her GPS history. Every message she sent to Brian, every location she'd been, was now documented. Step 2. Gather indisputable proof. The following Thursday, Jessica had another match scheduled. She left the house with the usual "don't wait up" and that same faint grin I'd grown to hate. This time, I wasn't going to sit in the parking lot like a spectator. I hired a private investigator. It felt ridiculous at first, like something out of a soap opera, but I needed evidence. Real, solid evidence. Something that wouldn't leave room for her to weasel her way out when the time came. The PI was thorough, snapping photos of Jessica and Brian holding hands in the parking lot, kissing in his truck, and heading into the same motel as before. Each photo hit me like a punch to the gut, but they also fueled my resolve. By the end of the week, I had everything I needed. The texts, the photos, even a log of their calls. She wasn't just cheating, she was practically making it a sport. Friday night, I decided it was time. Jessica came home late again, humming some pop tune as she dropped her purse on the counter. I was waiting for her in the living room, the file of evidence sitting on the coffee table in front of me. "Hey," I said, my voice steady. "We need to talk." She stopped mid-step, her smile fading as she glanced at the file. "What's this? Why don't you sit down?" Jessica hesitated, her eyes darting between me and the folder, but she sat. I picked it up and tossed it on her lap. "Open it." Her hands trembled as she flipped it open, her face draining of color as she looked at the photos, the texts, the GPS logs. For a second, she just stared at it, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't find the words. Finally, she managed to whisper, "Where did you get this? That's what you're worried about." I said, my voice icy. "Not the fact that you've been sneaking around with Brian for months? Or that you've been lying to my face every day?" She looked up at me, her eyes wide and glassy. "It's not what it looks like." I laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "It's exactly what it looks like, Jessica. You've been cheating on me, and not just once, over and over, with every guy who's ever bowled better than you." Her face twisted into a scowl. "That's not fair. You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I snapped, cutting her off. "You lose a match, and instead of practicing harder, you screw the guy who beat you. What is that, some kind of sick consolation prize?" Jessica stood up, slamming the folder shut. "You don't get it, Mike. You've been so checked out of this marriage. You don't even care about me anymore. You're always working or watching TV or pretending like I don't exist. At least Brian noticed me." Her words stung, but I wasn't about to let her rewrite history. "That's rich coming from the woman who's been sneaking off to motels behind my back. Don't you dare try to make this my fault." She crossed her arms, her eyes blazing. "Phoenix, you want the truth? Yeah, I've been cheating. But it wasn't just about Brian or the other guys. I wanted excitement. Something you clearly couldn't give me." Her words were a slap in the face. I stared at her, trying to comprehend how the woman I'd loved for 6 years could be this cruel. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then I spoke, my voice low but steady. "You're right about one thing, Jessica. This marriage hasn't been exciting. But you know what is? Watching you realize you've burned every bridge you had. Because I'm done. You've taken everything I gave you and crushed it under your bowling shoes. Congratulations, you win." Her eyes widened in panic. "Wait, what are you saying?" I stood, grabbing my jacket. "I'm saying I've already spoken to a lawyer. And by the way, I've made sure that none of my accounts depend on you anymore. Good luck explaining this to your next opponent." And with that, I walked out the door, leaving Jessica standing there, stunned. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Walking out the door that night felt like ripping off a bandage. Fast, painful, but oddly freeing. I drove for hours, no real destination in mind, just trying to outrun the whirlwind of emotions inside me. Anger, betrayal, sadness. It all churned together like a storm. I kept replaying Jessica's words in my head. I wanted excitement, something you couldn't give me. Was that all I was to her? Boring? Predictable? A placeholder for whatever thrill she craved? I ended up crashing at my buddy Dave's place. Dave's been my go-to guy since college, loyal to a fault, and the kind of person who could turn a disaster into a bad joke. He didn't ask too many questions when I showed up at his door, with a duffel bag and a 1,000-yard stare. "You look like hell," he said, handing me a beer. "Feel like it too," I muttered, sinking into his couch. We talked late into the night. I told him everything, Jessica, the motel, Brian, the lies. By the time I finished, Dave's face was a mix of disbelief and anger. "That's insane, man. I knew she was competitive. But this? What, did she think bowling was her dating app?" I chuckled bitterly. Guess I wasn't her type anymore. Maybe I should have started wearing bowling shirts and carrying a 16-pound ball around the house. Dave shook his head. You don't deserve this, Mike. But hey, if she thinks she's got secrets, maybe it's time you show her you've got some of your own. At first, I thought he was just trying to lighten the mood, but then it hit me. He was right. Jessica wasn't the only one who could play dirty. The next morning, I decided to dig deeper into Jessica's world. If she'd been hiding an affair or multiple affairs, what else was she keeping from me? Her phone backup had already given me a gold mine of information, but something told me there was more. I started with her email. While scrolling through her inbox, one thread caught my eye. An exchange between Jessica and her team captain, Amanda. The subject line read, "About the league rules." Curious, I opened it. Most of it was mundane, reminders about match schedules, lane assignments, that sort of thing. But one email, buried toward the bottom, stood out. Amanda, just a heads up, Brian got a warning about fraternizing with other players. It's technically against the league's code of conduct, but we don't enforce it unless someone complains. Keep it discreet. My heart raced as I read it again. Code of conduct? Was Brian's little extracurriculars a known thing? Was Jessica just one name on a list of his conquests? I felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just an affair, it was a pattern. That evening, I made a call to Amanda. She was surprised to hear from me, and even more surprised when I told her I wasn't calling to chat about Jessica's bowling stats. I know this is awkward, I started, but I think you know what I'm talking about. The thing with Brian and Jessica. There was a long pause. Mike, I'm really not supposed to get involved in this stuff. It's against league policy. Come on, Amanda. You're the captain. You got to know what's going on. Another pause, then a sigh. Fine. Yes, Brian's reputation is no secret. He's been warned before about crossing boundaries with players. But as long as no one files a formal complaint, there's not much we can do. And Jessica? I asked, my voice tight. Look, I like Jessica, but she's not innocent here. She's been cozying up to more than just Brian. There was Derek last fall, and I heard rumors about another guy from a neighboring league. I didn't want to believe it, but my blood boiled. More than Brian? How deep did this go? The next few days were a blur of quiet planning. I met with my lawyer to start the divorce process, making sure every move was calculated. I didn't just want to end the marriage. I wanted to walk away clean, with no loose ends tying me to Jessica's chaos. But the real twist came when I got a call from Amanda. Mike, I've been thinking, she said hesitantly. There's something you should know. It's about the league's finances. Jessica's been handling some of the accounting for our team. Okay, I said, not sure where this was going. She's been skimming funds, Amanda said flatly. It's not a lot, but enough that I noticed. I didn't want to accuse her without proof, but now I'm wondering if she's been using it to, fund her little side ventures. The room spun. Jessica wasn't just cheating, she was stealing. It was then that I realized this wasn't just about a broken marriage. Jessica had burned every bridge around her, and it was only a matter of time before the entire house of cards came crashing down. When Amanda told me Jessica had been skimming money from the league, it was like adding fuel to an already raging fire. Cheating on me with her bowling opponents was bad enough, but dipping into funds that didn't belong to her? That was next-level betrayal. I knew I had to act, but I wasn't just going to hand Amanda this information and let her handle it. No, this was personal now. Over the next week, I worked quietly to gather proof. Amanda, clearly sick of Jessica's antics, was all too happy to provide me access to the team's financial records. Sure enough, there was small, consistent withdrawals that didn't add up, tournament fees that were never submitted, cash payments that mysteriously disappeared. It wasn't enough to bankrupt the league, but it was definitely enough to raise some eyebrows. Meanwhile, Jessica was completely oblivious to the storm brewing around her. She came home every evening like nothing was wrong, talking about her upcoming match or some drama with the team. She even had the audacity to suggest we go on a vacation. To reconnect, she said. I almost laughed in her face. Instead, I told her, sure, let's talk about it this weekend. It was a lie, of course. I wasn't planning a vacation. I was planning her downfall. By Saturday morning, everything was in place. I met with Amanda and a couple of other league officials at a coffee shop. They weren't thrilled about the idea of confronting Jessica, But when I showed them the evidence, they couldn't deny the truth. She's been stealing from the league and breaking the code of conduct. I said, my voice calm but firm. If you don't handle this, I will. Amanda nodded reluctantly. We'll call a meeting. She's not going to like it, but this can't go on. Oh, I knew Jessica wasn't going to like it. That was the point. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, right after the league's match. Jessica left the house that evening in high spirits, completely unaware of what was waiting for her. I showed up at the bowling alley a few minutes after her, sitting in the back where she wouldn't notice me. The energy was different that night, tense like everyone knew something big was about to happen. Jessica was on lane 3, laughing and chatting with Brian like nothing in the world could touch her. Watching them, I felt the familiar sting of betrayal, but it was quickly replaced by satisfaction. Tonight wasn't going to end the way she expected. The match ended around 9 p.m. Jessica's team lost again. No surprise there, but she didn't seem too upset. She even hugged Brian goodbye before heading toward the locker room. That's when Amanda stepped in. Jessica, can we talk for a second? Amanda said, her tone neutral but firm. Jessica looked confused but followed Amanda into a side room where the other officials were waiting. I stayed in the background, watching through the glass door as the conversation unfolded. At first, Jessica seemed calm, nodding along as Amanda spoke. But then Amanda pulled out the financial records and laid them on the table. I saw Jessica's face go pale, her composure slipping as she frantically tried to explain herself. I don't know what this is, she said, her voice loud enough that I could hear through the door. There must be a mistake. Amanda wasn't having it. She pointed to the records, her expression stern. Jessica, we've been over these numbers. There's no mistake. You've been skimming funds for months, and we need answers. Jessica's voice rose, defensive and shrill. This is ridiculous. You're accusing me of something I didn't do. I've been nothing but loyal to this league. That's when Amanda hit her with the second blow. And let's not forget the code of conduct violations, Amanda said, her tone icy. We've received complaints about your behavior with other players, specifically Brian. You've put this league in jeopardy, and we can't allow it to continue. Jessica's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She looked around the room, searching for someone to back her up, but no one said a word. I stepped into the room then, making my presence known. Oh, don't stop now, I said, leaning against the doorframe. This is getting good. Jessica's eyes widened in shock. Mike, what are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing. I replied, my voice dripping with sarcasm. But I think Amanda's already covered that pretty well. Her face twisted into a mask of anger. You set this up, didn't you? You bet I did, I said, stepping closer. Because I'm done letting you play me for a fool. You've been cheating on me, stealing from the league, and lying to everyone around you. Did you really think you'd get away with it forever? Jessica's voice cracked as she tried to defend herself. It's not what it looks like. You don't understand. Oh, I understand perfectly, I interrupted. You wanted excitement, right? Well, congratulations, you've got it. Enjoy explaining this to the league, and to Brian, and to whoever else you've been screwing over. The room was silent as Jessica slumped into a chair, her face pale and her hands trembling. Amanda cleared her throat. Jessica, effective immediately, you're suspended from the league. We'll be conducting a full investigation into the missing funds, and if necessary, we'll involve the authorities. Jessica didn't say another word. She just sat there, staring at the table, her once unshakable confidence crumbling before my eyes. As I walked out of the bowling alley that night, I felt a strange sense of closure. Jessica's world was beginning to collapse, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. There was still one final move to make, and it was going to hit Jessica harder than she ever imagined. Jessica didn't come home that night. I wasn't surprised. After what went down at the bowling alley, she probably needed time to lick her wounds. Frankly, I didn't care where she was. I was done caring. I spent the next morning meeting with my lawyer to finalize the divorce papers. The stack of evidence I had gathered was more than enough to ensure the process went in my favor. I wasn't interested in dragging this out or giving Jessica the chance to weasel her way into a better deal. Let's make this airtight, I told my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Denise. Don't worry, she replied, flipping through the file. With everything you've given me, she doesn't have a leg to stand on. If she tries to contest this, it'll only make her look worse. I left the office feeling a sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, I had the upper hand. Jessica finally showed up late that evening, her face red and puffy like she'd been crying all day. She didn't say anything at first, just dropped her purse on the counter and stood there, staring at the floor. Rough day? I asked, my tone casual but cutting. She flinched, but then her expression hardened. You didn't have to humiliate me like that, Mike. Oh, I think I did. I shot back, crossing my arms. You've been lying to me for months. Cheating. Stealing. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences? Jessica took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. I made mistakes. I know that. But you didn't have to air it all out in front of everyone. I laughed bitterly. You mean the way you aired out our marriage for Brian? Or Derek? Or whoever else was convenient when you were feeling bored? Her face crumpled, and for a moment I thought she was going to cry again. But instead, she straightened up and said, fine. If this is how you want to play it, let's just get it over with. Glad we're on the same page, I said, pulling a manila envelope from the kitchen drawer. I tossed it onto the counter in front of her. What's this? She asked, eyeing it suspiciously. Divorce papers, I said bluntly. I've already signed them. All that's left is for you to do the same. Her hands trembled as she picked up the envelope and flipped through the documents. You really went this far? You went farther, I replied, my voice cold. Jessica sat down at the table, staring at the papers for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she looked up at me, her expression a mix of anger and desperation. What about the house? The accounts? What am I supposed to do? I shrugged. You'll figure it out. You wanted excitement, remember? Consider this a fresh start. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. She grabbed a pen from the counter and started signing the papers, her movements sharp and angry. When she was done, she threw the pen down and stood up. There, happy now? Ecstatic, I said, taking the papers and sliding them back into the envelope. I'll file these first thing tomorrow. Jessica grabbed her purse and headed for the door, but before she left, she turned back to me. You're a real piece of work, Mike. Right back at you, Jess, I replied with a smirk. That night, I sat alone in the living room, sipping a beer and staring at the divorce papers. It felt surreal, like I was finally closing the door on a chapter of my life I'd never expected to end this way. But I wasn't done yet. There was one more thing I needed to do. The next day, I called Amanda. Hey, can you give me Brian's number? I asked, trying to sound casual. Why? She asked, clearly suspicious. Don't worry, I said. I'm not looking to start a fight. I just think he deserves to know exactly what kind of mess he's gotten himself into. Amanda hesitated, but eventually she gave me the number. That evening I called Brian. He answered on the second ring, his voice cocky and smooth. Hello. It's Mike, I said. There was a pause, then a nervous chuckle. Ooh, hey, man, what's up? Oh, not much, I replied, leaning back in my chair. Just thought you'd like to know Jessica and I are getting divorced. Figured it'd save you some trouble down the line. Brian didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was tense. Look, man, I don't know what she told you, but I cut him off. Spare me the excuses, Brian. I know everything. And just so you're aware, Jessica is not exactly the loyal type. You might want to keep an eye on your wallet and your teammates. He tried to stammer out a response, but I hung up before he could finish. By the time the papers were officially filed, Jessica had already moved out. She didn't leave much behind. Just a couple of boxes of junk I didn't care about and a half-empty bottle of her favorite wine. The house felt emptier without her, but it also felt lighter, like I could finally breathe again. I don't know where Jessica ended up, and honestly, I don't care. All I know is that I walked away from this mess with my dignity intact, and a reminder never to let anyone bowl over me again. The silence in the house was deafening. For the first few days after Jessica moved out, I didn't know what to do with myself. The house we'd built together now felt like a hollow shell, filled with memories I couldn't stand to look at. Everywhere I turned, there were reminders of her. A framed photo from our honeymoon, her favorite mug in the cupboard, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the bedroom. At first, I thought about throwing everything away, erasing every trace of her from my life. But something stopped me. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the nagging thought that purging the house wouldn't purge the pain. So I left it all as it was like some sort of emotional crime scene. One night, about a week after she left, I found myself sitting on the couch with a box of her stuff. Old birthday cards, ticket stubs, random knickknacks she'd collected over the years. I held a tiny snow globe in my hand, the kind you'd find in a cheap souvenir shop. We picked it up during a road trip to the mountains one summer. She'd insisted on buying it, even though I'd rolled my eyes at the time. Now, as I turned it over in my hands, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite describe. Sadness? Regret? Loss? Maybe all three. I put the snow globe back in the box and sealed it shut. I wasn't ready to throw it away, but I wasn't ready to keep it out either. The days started to blur together. I went to work, came home, ate dinner, and repeated the cycle. My friends tried to check in on me, Dave especially, but I wasn't great company. "You can't just sit here and stew in this, man," Dave said one night, plopping down on the couch next to me. "You gotta get out there. Do something. Anything." I shrugged. "Like what?" "Anything but this," he said, gesturing to the empty beer cans on the coffee table and the reruns of The Office playing in the background. He had a point. The next morning, I decided to take a small step. I went for a run, something I hadn't done in years. At first, it was miserable. My lungs burned, my legs ached, and I felt like quitting after the first 5 minutes. But I kept going, one foot in front of the other, until I found myself at the park where Jessica and I used to go on weekends. I stopped at a bench near the playground and sat there, watching the world go by. Families laughing, kids playing, couples holding hands. It hurt to see them, but it also reminded me that life went on. That day marked the beginning of my healing. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into new routines. I started running regularly, joined a local gym, and even signed up for a cooking class. Spoiler: I'm still terrible at making pasta from scratch, but at least I tried. The house started to feel less like a monument to my failed marriage and more like my space. I redecorated the living room, replaced the framed honeymoon photo with a picture of me and Dave from our college days, and donated a bunch of old furniture I never liked anyway. It wasn't just about physical changes. It was about reclaiming my life. Then came the inevitable message from Jessica. It was late on a Friday night when my phone buzzed. I didn't recognize the number at first, but the text was unmistakably from her. "Jessica, hey, can we talk?" I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting in knots. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to leave her on read and let her deal with the consequences of her actions. But another part of me, a smaller, quieter part, wanted closure. After a few minutes, I replied, "Me, what do you want to talk about?" Her response came quickly. "Jessica, I'm sorry for everything. I know I messed up, but I need you to know I never stopped loving you." I laughed bitterly. Loving me? Was that what she called sneaking around with Brian and stealing from her league? I thought about ignoring her again, but instead I typed back, "Me, loving me doesn't look like what you did, Jessica. I've moved on. You should too." She didn't reply after that. The conversation, brief as it was, felt like the final nail in the coffin. For so long, I'd been carrying the weight of her betrayal, the anger and sadness swirling around in my head. But after that night, I realized I didn't need an apology from her to heal. I didn't need anything from her. Jessica was a chapter in my life, one that was messy, painful, and full of lessons I didn't ask for. But it was over now, and I was ready to turn the page. The house is quiet these days, but it's a different kind of quiet. Not the suffocating silence of betrayal, but the peaceful stillness of a fresh start. I still go for runs in the park, but now I stop at the coffee shop on the corner and treat myself to a cappuccino afterward. I'm slowly rebuilding, piece by piece, and while it's not always easy, it feels good. Life after betrayal is strange. It's like learning to walk again, one shaky step at a time. For months, I felt like I was trudging through quicksand, weighed down by anger, sadness, and endless questions. Why had Jessica done it? Could I have prevented it? Was I somehow to blame? But as time passed, those questions started to lose their grip on me. Instead of focusing on what I'd lost, I began to notice what I still had, and what I'd gained through the wreckage. The first lesson was harsh but necessary. You can't control other people's choices. No matter how much love, effort, or patience you give, some people will still choose to hurt you. Jessica's betrayal wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was a reflection of her character. Realizing that was liberating. For so long, I carried the weight of her decisions as though they were my fault. But the truth was I'd done my best. The rest was on her. The second lesson came from the quiet moments, those stretches of loneliness where it felt like the walls were closing in. I learned that being alone isn't the same as being lonely. At first, the silence of an empty house felt unbearable. But over time, it became peaceful. I started to enjoy my own company, filling the quiet with things that brought me joy, books, music, even learning how to cook. Spoiler, I make a mean chicken parmesan now. One day, while clearing out the last of Jessica's things, I came across a dusty, old notebook in the back of a closet. Flipping through it, I realized it was mine, something I'd used years ago to jot down ideas for short stories. Writing had been a passion of mine in college, but somewhere along the way, I let it slip through the cracks of work, marriage, and life. I started writing again, at first just for myself. It was messy and cathartic, like emptying out a drawer full of tangled cords. But as I poured my thoughts onto the page, I felt lighter. The act of creating something, even out of pain, was healing in a way I hadn't expected. The final lesson, and the hardest one, was about forgiveness. Not for Jessica. I wasn't ready for that, and maybe I never would be. But forgiving myself? That was non-negotiable. For a long time, I blamed myself for not seeing the signs sooner, for letting my marriage drift into autopilot, for trusting her in the first place. But the truth is, I did the best I could with what I knew at the time. Holding on to that guilt wasn't helping me. It was just another weight I needed to shed. Fast forward a year, and my life looks completely different. I sold the house Jessica and I shared and moved into a smaller place, a cozy little rental with a big backyard. It's not flashy, but it's mine and it feels like a fresh start. I've made new friends through my running group and my cooking class, people who didn't know Mike and Jessica, just Mike. It's refreshing to be seen as my own person again, not as half of a fractured whole. Dating is still tricky. I've been on a few dates, but I'm taking my time. I'm not looking to rush into anything or fill a void. I want to build something real, something grounded in trust and honesty. As for Jessica, I haven't heard much. Word around the league is that she moved out of state after the fallout. Amanda told me she's trying to start fresh, but honestly, I don't think about her much anymore. She's a part of my past, and that's where she belongs. If there's one thing I've learned through all this, it's that pain doesn't have to define you. It can shape you, yes, but it doesn't have to be the final word in your story. Jessica's betrayal broke me, but it also forced me to rebuild myself from the ground up. And in the process, I discovered parts of myself I'd forgotten. My resilience, my creativity, my ability to find joy in the small things. I'm not the same person I was before, but I like the person I'm becoming. Stronger, wiser, free. The thing about moving forward is that it doesn't happen in one big leap. It's a series of small steps, sometimes barely noticeable, until one day you look back and realize how far you've come. That's where I found myself about 18 months after Jessica walked out of my life. I was sitting on my back porch, sipping coffee and watching the sun rise over the trees. The air was crisp, the kind that feels alive with possibility. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't haunted by the weight of the past. Instead, I was looking forward, thinking about what could be. It started with a small decision. I wanted to travel. Jessica and I had always talked about it, but never made it a priority. There was always a reason to wait. A busy work schedule, saving for the future, the never-ending list of someday plans. But now, there was nothing holding me back. I booked a solo trip to Colorado, a week in the Rockies, just me in the mountains. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. I'd never traveled alone before, and the idea of spending a week in my own company felt both daunting and freeing. The trip turned out to be exactly what I needed. I hiked trails that left me breathless, both from the views and the altitude, sat by crystal-clear lakes, and wrote pages and pages in my notebook. There was something healing about being surrounded by nature, disconnected from the noise of daily life. By the time I returned home, I felt like I'd unlocked a new part of myself. Someone who didn't just survive, but thrived. Back in my routine, I started noticing changes in myself. I laughed more easily, felt lighter on my feet, and found joy in the simplest things. It was as if I'd been carrying a heavy backpack for years and finally set it down. Even my friends noticed the difference. "You're like a whole new person," Dave said one night over beers. "A happy one even." "Don't push it." I joked, but he wasn't wrong. The biggest surprise came one Saturday morning at the farmer's market. I was wandering through the stalls, picking up some fresh vegetables and homemade bread, when I bumped into someone literally. "Oh, sorry about that," she said, laughing as she steadied herself. "No worries," I replied, looking up to see who I'd run into. Her name was Rachel, and she was holding a basket of peaches she'd nearly dropped. She had a warm smile, the kind that made you feel instantly at ease, and we ended up chatting for a few minutes about the market and the best places to grab coffee nearby. It wasn't until she walked away that I realized I'd been smiling the whole time. A few weeks later, we ran into each other again at the same market. This time, she invited me to join her for coffee, and I said yes without hesitation. Rachel wasn't anything like Jessica, and that was a good thing. She was kind, down to earth, and refreshingly honest. Over the next few months, we got to know each other better, sharing stories about our lives, our pasts, and our dreams for the future. I told her about Jessica, about the betrayal, the divorce, and the messy road to healing. Rachel listened without judgment, nodding thoughtfully as I spoke. "That couldn't have been easy," she said. "It wasn't," I admitted, "but it taught me a lot about myself, and about what I want and don't want in a relationship." Rachel smiled. "Sounds like you've done a lot of growing." "Still a work in progress," I said with a shrug. "Aren't we all?" she replied. Things with Rachel are still new, but they feel good. Different. Real. I don't know where this road will lead, but for the first time in a long time, I'm excited to find out. Looking back on everything, I can see how far I've come. Jessica's betrayal was a turning point, a painful, messy one, but it set me on a path to rediscovering myself. I've learned to let go of the past, embrace the present, and look forward to the future with hope. Life isn't perfect, but it's mine. And that's enough. It was a chilly Sunday morning when I got the email. I'd almost missed it, tucked between spam and a promo for discounted car insurance. The subject line read, "I need to apologize, Jessica." For a moment, I just stared at it. Her name felt foreign now, like reading a word in a language I barely remembered. My gut reaction was to delete it without opening it. What could she possibly say that I hadn't already figured out on my own? But curiosity, or maybe closure, got the better of me. I clicked it. "Mike, I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, and I wouldn't blame you for ignoring this. But I've been carrying the weight of what I did to you, and I need to say a few things. First, I'm sorry. Truly. Not just for cheating, but for everything. Lying to you, hurting you, and destroying the trust we had. You didn't deserve that, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I wish I could explain why I did what I did, but honestly, I'm not sure I even understand it myself. I was selfish, bored, and looking for something to fill a void that I should have worked on with you, not against you. I've spent a lot of time in therapy since the divorce, and while it doesn't excuse my actions, I realized how much of my behavior came from my own insecurities and unhappiness. That was my burden to carry, not yours, and I'm sorry I made you pay for it. I heard you've been doing well, and I'm glad. You deserve that, Mike. You deserve all the happiness in the world. Take care, Jessica." I sat there for a while after reading it, my coffee going cold on the table. A part of me wanted to scoff at her words, to call it too little, too late. But another part, the part I'd worked so hard to nurture over the past year, felt something else. Relief. Not because I needed her apology to move on. I'd already done that. But because it confirmed what I'd always suspected. Her choices weren't about me. They were about her. I didn't respond to the email. What was there to say? I'd already closed that door, and reopening it felt unnecessary. Instead, I hit archive and went about my day, feeling lighter than I had in months. A few weeks later, I had my first real test of how far I'd come. Rachel and I were walking downtown after dinner, laughing about the awful cover band playing at the restaurant, when I heard someone call my name. Mike! I turned around, and there she was. Jessica. She looked different. Not bad, just different. Her hair was shorter, her clothes more casual, like she'd shed the overly polished version of herself I used to know. Her eyes flicked from me to Rachel, and for a moment, I saw a flash of something. Regret, maybe, before she smiled awkwardly. Wow, I didn't think I'd see you here, she said. Hey, Jessica, I said, keeping my tone neutral. Rachel, sensing the history, slipped her hand into mine, but stayed quiet. Jessica hesitated, then said, I just wanted to say, thanks for reading my email. And for everything. I mean it. I nodded. Take care, Jessica. She lingered for a moment before walking away, disappearing into the crowd. As Rachel and I continued our walk, she finally spoke. That was her, wasn't it? Yeah, I said with a small smile. And you know what? Seeing her didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It was just closure. Rachel squeezed my hand. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Mike. I thought about that for a moment and realized she was right. That encounter was the final piece of the puzzle. Jessica was a part of my story, but she wasn't the story. The real story was about how I found myself again, how I rebuilt my life, and how I learned to love both myself and others with more intention and clarity. Now, as I sit on my back porch, sipping my morning coffee, I feel nothing but gratitude. Not for Jessica's betrayal, but for the resilience it forced me to discover. Life isn't perfect, but it's real, and it's mine. And as the sun rises over the trees, I know that I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. As the months rolled on, my life continued to take on new layers. Rachel and I were growing closer, but it wasn't the whirlwind, all-consuming kind of relationship I'd once had with Jessica. It was steady, deliberate, and rooted in mutual respect. We took our time, exploring not just each other's lives, but our own paths, making sure we didn't lose ourselves in the process. One Saturday morning, Rachel invited me to meet her parents. It felt like a big step, but instead of the dread I might have felt a year ago, I was excited. Meeting someone's family meant trust and commitment, something I hadn't thought I'd be ready for so soon. The visit went better than I could have imagined. Her parents were warm and welcoming, her dad cracking bad jokes while her mom grilled me about my favorite recipes. As we sat around their kitchen table, I couldn't help but feel like I was experiencing something I hadn't realized I was missing, a sense of belonging. That night, as we drove back to my place, Rachel reached over and took my hand. You did great, she said, grinning. Yeah? Even after your mom asked if I could bake. I joked. She laughed. Especially then. She doesn't like anyone, but I think you're the exception. Her words stuck with me, not because I needed her mom's approval, but because it reminded me how different this relationship was. With Rachel, I felt seen, valued, not like an accessory to someone else's life, but as an equal partner. The turning point came a few weeks later when Rachel suggested we take a weekend trip together. Where to? I asked. There's this little cabin I love, up by the lake, she said. It's quiet, peaceful. I think you'd like it. I hesitated for a moment, memories of the trip Jessica and I had planned flashing through my mind. That trip had been a symbol of a life that never came to fruition. But this was different. Let's do it, I said. The cabin turned out to be exactly as Rachel described, cozy and tucked away, with a stunning view of the lake. We spent the weekend hiking, cooking together, and talking late into the night. On the last evening, as the sun set over the water, Rachel looked at me with a soft smile. You've come a long way, you know, she said. What do you mean? When we first met, there was this heaviness about you, she said. Like you were carrying something too big to put down. But now, you seem lighter. I thought about her words, about everything I'd been through since Jessica's betrayal. She was right. I had come a long way. And for the first time in years, I wasn't looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next shoe to drop. I was present, living in the moment, and looking forward instead of backward. I guess I have, I said, pulling her close. As the seasons changed, so did my outlook. My life wasn't perfect, but it felt real, grounded, and filled with possibility. Rachel became a bigger part of my world, and I became part of hers. We weren't rushing toward anything. We didn't need to. What we had was steady, sure, and built on trust. One evening, as we sat together on my porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Rachel turned to me and said, "You know, I think you're the bravest person I've ever met." I laughed, shaking my head. "Brave? I don't know about that." "I do," she said firmly. "It takes courage to rebuild your life after something like what you went through. And it takes even more courage to open your heart again." Her words hit me harder than I expected. She was right. It had taken courage, not just to survive Jessica's betrayal, but to move forward, to let myself trust again. And in that moment, sitting next to Rachel with the future wide open before us, I realized something. I wasn't just healing. I was thriving. Life had fallen into a rhythm. The mornings were peaceful. The evenings were filled with laughter and quiet moments with Rachel. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had full control of my life. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. And this time, the past came knocking. It was a Friday afternoon when I got a call from an unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Hello, Mike." The voice on the other end was hesitant, but unmistakable. "Jessica." I froze. It had been nearly 2 years since our divorce, and we hadn't spoken since that awkward run-in downtown. Hearing her voice now was like pulling the scab off an old wound. "What do you want, Jessica?" I asked, keeping my tone even. There was a pause before she spoke again. "I need to see you. Please. It's important." Every instinct screamed at me to say no, to hang up and move on with my life. But there was something in her voice, something I couldn't quite place. Desperation? Regret? "Fine," I said finally. "Tomorrow. At the coffee shop on Main. Noon." The next day, I arrived early, more out of nervous energy than anything else. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew I wasn't the same person she'd walked all over 2 years ago. Jessica arrived a few minutes later, looking thinner and more tired than I remembered. She wore a simple cardigan and jeans, her usual polished appearance replaced by something more subdued. "Thanks for meeting me," she said, sitting down across from me. "What do you want, Jessica?" I repeated, cutting straight to the point. She winced, but nodded, as if expecting my bluntness. "I'm not here to cause trouble, I swear. I need to tell you something." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "Then tell me." She hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously. "I've made a lot of mistakes, Mike. More than I can count. And I don't expect you to forgive me, but there's something I've been carrying since the divorce, and I need to get it off my chest." I said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "When we were married," she began, her voice trembling, "I wasn't just cheating with Brian. There were others. And one of them, he wasn't just another fling. He was someone I thought I could build a future with. But it fell apart, and when it did, I realized how much I'd thrown away." Her words hit me like a freight train, not because they surprised me, but because they confirmed what I'd already suspected. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice calm but cold. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Because I can't move forward until I face what I've done. I know I hurt you more than anyone, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But I needed you to know the truth." I stared at her for a long moment, letting her words sink in. Part of me wanted to lash out, to tell her that her confession didn't matter anymore. But the other part, the part of me that had worked so hard to heal, felt strangely at peace. "I appreciate your honesty," I said finally. "But Jessica, your truth doesn't change my life anymore. I've moved on. I've found someone who respects me, who values what we have, and who doesn't need to tear me down to build herself up." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm glad, Mike. You deserve that." We sat in silence for a moment before she stood up. "Take care of yourself," she said softly. "You too," I replied, and watched as she walked away for what I hoped would be the last time. That night, I told Rachel about the meeting. She listened quietly, her hand resting on mine, her presence grounding me. "How do you feel about it?" she asked when I finished. "Lighter," I admitted. "It's like the last loose thread finally got tied up." She smiled. "I'm proud of you. That couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," I said, squeezing her hand. "But it's over now. For good. Life didn't go back to normal after that meeting. It went forward. Jessica's confession was a reminder of how far I'd come and of how much I'd gained by letting her go. And as Rachel and I sat together on the couch that night, laughing at some silly movie, I realized something. The past might knock every now and then, but it no longer had the power to break me. The weekend after Jessica's surprise confession, I found myself reflecting more than usual. Not about her. Those days were behind me, but about what it meant to really move forward. Meeting Rachel had been a blessing, and for the first time in years, I was building a relationship that felt sturdy, genuine, and free of the cracks I'd ignored in my past. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that I owed it to both of us to take the next step, something tangible to solidify that this wasn't just a rebound or a patch to cover old wounds. Rachel deserved that clarity, and so did I. On a warm Saturday morning, we decided to take a hike on one of Rachel's favorite trails. It was a beautiful spot, a mix of shaded woods and sunny clearings that opened up to breathtaking views of rolling hills. We'd packed sandwiches and a thermos of coffee, planning to make a day of it. As we walked, Rachel's excitement was contagious. She'd point out wildflowers along the path, name birds by their calls, and occasionally dart ahead to snap pictures of particularly scenic spots. I couldn't help but smile. "You know," I said as we reached a small clearing, "you're kind of amazing." She laughed, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Where's that coming from?" "Just thinking about how different things feel with you," I said. "In a good way." She stopped walking and turned to face me, her expression soft. "Different how?" "Like, I'm not afraid," I admitted. "When I was with Jessica, I always felt like I had to watch my step, like one wrong move would send everything crashing down. But with you, it feels steady, real, like I can just be myself." Her eyes shimmered with emotion, and she reached out to take my hand. "That's because we're building this together, Mike. There's no room for fear when you trust each other." We reached the top of the trail around lunchtime, setting up our little picnic on a flat rock overlooking the hills. The view was stunning, but all I could focus on was Rachel. As we ate, we talked about everything, our favorite childhood memories, the places we wanted to travel, the things we still wanted to accomplish. It felt like peeling back another layer of her, and I realized just how deeply I cared for her. When we finished eating, Rachel leaned back against a tree, her face turned up toward the sun. "This is perfect," she said with a contented sigh. "Yeah, it is," I agreed, my heart pounding as I reached into my bag. "Rachel," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. She opened her eyes and looked at me, her brow furrowing slightly. "I've been thinking a lot lately," I began, holding her gaze. "About us. About how much you mean to me and how different my life feels with you in it." I pulled out a small, intricately wrapped box and handed it to her. Her eyes widened as she took it, glancing from the box to me. "Mike, what is this?" "Open it and find out," I said with a nervous smile. She carefully unwrapped the box and lifted the lid. Inside was a simple, elegant bracelet, a silver chain with a small charm shaped like a mountain peak. "It's not, you know that," I said quickly, seeing her breath hitch. "Not yet anyway. But it's a promise. That I'm here, that I'm all in, and that I want to keep building this with you, one step at a time." Rachel's eyes filled with tears, and she slipped the bracelet on her wrist before throwing her arms around me. "It's perfect," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The rest of the hike felt lighter, like we'd crossed an invisible threshold together. That night, as we sat on my porch watching the stars, Rachel leaned her head on my shoulder. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "I think this is the happiest I've ever been." I kissed the top of her head, my heart swelling. "Me too." Rachel's bracelet became more than just a symbol. It was a reminder of the steady foundation we were building. Every time I saw it glint on her wrist, I felt grounded, like I'd finally found the kind of relationship I didn't just want but deserved. But life, as always, doesn't just hand you peace on a silver platter. It makes you work for it. It started with a call from my mom one Tuesday evening. I was in the kitchen, experimenting with a new pasta recipe Rachel and I had been planning to try together, when my phone buzzed. "Hey, Mom." I answered, balancing the phone between my ear and shoulder as I chopped onions. Her voice was tense, the kind of tone that immediately puts you on edge. "Mike, it's your dad. He's in the hospital." I froze. "What happened?" She explained that Dad had collapsed while working in the garden. The doctors were still running tests, but they suspected it was his heart. "I'm on my way," I said, already grabbing my keys. Rachel insisted on coming with me. "You shouldn't do this alone," she said, and I was too shaken to argue. The drive to the hospital was quiet, the air thick with unspoken worries. Rachel reached over and took my hand, her presence steadying me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. When we arrived, my mom was in the waiting room, her face pale and drawn. She hugged me tightly, her usual stoicism cracking just enough to let me see the fear she was trying to hold back. "Dad's tough," I said, more to reassure myself than her. "He's going to pull through." Rachel stayed by my side the entire night, offering quiet support while I tried to process what was happening. Dad ended up needing surgery, a stent to clear a blocked artery. The doctors assured us he'd make a full recovery, but seeing him in that hospital bed, pale and hooked up to monitors, was a wake-up call. As I sat by his bedside, watching him sleep, Rachel came in with 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to me and sat down in the chair next to mine. "You okay?" she asked gently. I nodded, though the lump in my throat made it hard to speak. "It just makes you think, you know? About time. About family." Rachel placed her hand on mine. "You've got all the time in the world to make the most of it, Mike. You're already doing that." The days that followed were a blur of hospital visits and family dinners, the kind where everyone tiptoes around the big questions, pretending everything's fine. Rachel fit seamlessly into the chaos, helping my mom with meals and keeping my younger sister, Liz, distracted with stories about her work as a freelance photographer. By the time Dad was discharged, I realized something. Rachel wasn't just part of my life. She was part of my family. That realization hit me hard one evening, about a week after Dad came home. Rachel and I were sitting on my couch, watching some nature documentary she loved. I wasn't paying much attention to the screen. My mind was elsewhere, turning over the past few weeks. "Rachel," I said suddenly, turning to her. She paused the documentary and looked at me, her eyes warm and curious. "What's up? I don't think I've ever told you how much you mean to me," I said, my voice catching slightly. "These past few weeks have been a lot, but having you there, seeing how you cared for my family, how you cared for me, it made me realize something." Her expression softened. "What's that?" "That I don't want to waste any more time," I said, reaching for her hand. "I know we've been taking things slow, and I love that about us. But I also know that you're it for me, Rachel. You're the person I want to build a life with." Tears filled her eyes as she smiled. "Mike, you have no idea how long I've been waiting to hear you say that." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of planning. Not for a wedding, but for something even more important, a shared future. We started looking for a place together, something that felt like ours, a space where we could keep growing and building. One afternoon, as we toured a small but charming house with a big backyard and plenty of natural light, Rachel turned to me and grinned. "This is it," she said, her excitement contagious. "Yeah," I said, looking around and feeling a deep sense of certainty. "This is it." Moving in together was both exciting and challenging. We learned new things about each other, like how Rachel had a habit of leaving half-empty coffee mugs all over the house, and how I was annoyingly particular about how the dishwasher should be loaded. But we laughed through it all, navigating each bump with the kind of patience I'd never known in a relationship before. One evening, as we sat on the porch of our new home, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Rachel leaned her head on my shoulder. "This feels good," she said softly. "It feels like home," I replied, wrapping an arm around her. And for the first time in years, I realized I wasn't just surviving. I was living. Life in the new house with Rachel felt like a dream most days. We spent lazy Sundays working on the backyard, planting flowers and dreaming about the vegetable garden we'd start next spring. Weeknights were filled with laughter, shared meals, and quiet moments that felt more intimate than any grand gesture. But, as life often does, the peace didn't last forever. The first crack in our new life appeared one Tuesday morning when Rachel's phone rang during breakfast. She looked at the screen, her face suddenly pale. "Everything okay?" I asked, setting my coffee down. It's my mom, she said, her voice trembling. She never calls this early. She answered the call, her brow furrowing as she listened. What? When? Is she? Rachel's voice broke, and tears welled up in her eyes. Okay, I'll be there as soon as I can. When she hung up, she turned to me, her expression stricken. My sister was in a car accident. She's in surgery now, but it's bad. Rachel booked the next flight out to Chicago, where her family lived, and I insisted on driving her to the airport. The whole way there, she sat quietly, twisting her bracelet nervously around her wrist. Do you want me to come with you? I asked as we pulled up to the terminal. No, it's okay, she said, her voice shaky. I don't even know how long I'll be there. But thank you. I hugged her tightly, feeling her tremble in my arms. Call me if you need anything, I said. I mean it, Rachel. Anything. She nodded, kissed me on the cheek, and disappeared into the airport. The days that followed were heavy. Rachel kept me updated through sporadic texts. Her sister, Emily, had survived the surgery but was in critical condition. Rachel spent her days at the hospital, sitting by Emily's bedside, and her nights with her parents, trying to hold everyone together. I wanted to be there for her, but the distance was suffocating. All I could do was send messages of support and hope that she felt the strength I was trying to offer. A week later, Rachel called me late at night. Mike, she said, her voice weary but steady. Emily's stable now. She's not out of the woods yet, but it's looking better. That's great news, I said, relief flooding through me. And how are you holding up? There was a long pause. Honestly, I'm exhausted. But my parents, they're a wreck. I've been trying to keep it together for them. But it's a lot. Come home, I said gently. Even just for a few days. You can't pour from an empty cup, Rachel. She didn't answer right away, but when she did, her voice was soft. I think I need that. I'll book a flight for tomorrow. When I picked Rachel up from the airport the next evening, she looked drained but grateful. The moment she saw me, she broke down, tears streaming down her face as I wrapped her in a hug. I'm so glad you're here, she whispered. Always, I said, holding her close. Over the next few days, I made it my mission to help Rachel recharge. I cooked her favorite meals, made her laugh with bad impressions of the overly dramatic chef on one of her favorite cooking shows, and gave her the space to talk, or not talk, about everything that had happened. By the end of the week, she seemed lighter, her energy returning little by little. You've been amazing, she said one evening as we sat on the couch. I don't know how I'd get through this without you. You don't have to, I said simply. We're a team, remember? Her eyes shimmered with emotion, and she nodded. We are, and I don't think I've ever loved you more than I do right now. Rachel returned to Chicago the following week, but this time, she wasn't carrying the same weight. Her sister continued to recover, and Rachel's parents started leaning on each other more instead of relying solely on her. The experience brought us closer in ways I hadn't expected. It reminded me that love isn't just about the good times. It's about showing up when things are hard, when life feels heavy, and when the future is uncertain. Months later, as Rachel and I sat in our backyard, watching the first shoots of our vegetable garden poke through the soil, she reached over and took my hand. You know, she said, her voice soft, I think we've built something pretty incredible here. I smiled, squeezing her hand. Yeah, we have. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. And as I looked at Rachel, I knew one thing for certain. No matter what life threw at us, we'd face it together.